if they are yours. And if they're not yours and you're blind, you might ought to try them. All right, we have made our way. We've looked at a little bit some different materials than we have available for us here, but we're on page number 23. I have marked on page 23, and we've talked about how that, in addition to some of the information that's here, and we'll actually run over the historical situation in which the audacity of offering a hog on the altar in the temple was actually engaged in, and that was just one of many things that were done as an affront to Judaism, forbidding circumcising the children, male children on the 8th day as the law of Moses required, refusal to allow them to remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, just a whole lot of things, even destroying what few copies of the old law was available. They did that too, of course. And of course, that can have two different results. It can cause people, well, generally speaking, I'm not going to say in every situation, but it can cause people to say, okay, if it's going to be that hard, then I'm just going to forget about it and do what I want to do over here and not rock the boat, not bother anybody, and maybe get through this life with my head on my shoulders. Or you can become very nationalistic, is a term that we're going to be seeing here as it relates to a specific family, and you can say, well, they might kill me, but I'm still going to do what the Bible tells me to do, or what the law of Moses requires of me. And of course, when you have to make a decision as to one of those two things, then we are left with the question that we'd ask ourselves, well, what would I do? If I was living in this time frame and I had been blessed to be a part of this nation of people through whom the Messiah is supposed to come, to whom the oracles of God had been committed, am I going to live faithful to that law to the best of my ability, even to the point that my life is taken, or am I not? Which one will it be? Well, of course, that principle applies in the New Testament as well to Christians. That passage that we oftentimes quote and even times we'll use at the end of the plan of salvation on our screen, Revelation chapter 2 verse 10, be thou faithful unto death, and I'll give thee a crown of life. Now we know that the principle there is not to live to a ripe old age and being faithful all those years, while that's obviously required. The idea is being faithful in the face of being crucified or killed because you're a Christian. That's the idea associated with that particular verse of Scripture. Now, and that's two different ways. It'd be wonderful if you could live faithful and not have to worry about somebody cutting your head off. But what if they did want to cut your head off? What if your faithfulness would result in you possibly being put on the chopping block, And of course, as is the case in the first century, and the persecution that was felt first from the Jews and then from the Roman government as well, then it was a very, very hard thing to be a Christian in the first century. The difficulties that they faced make the things that we think are problems today look like nothing, for sure, because they underwent tremendous persecution and yet were remaining faithful throughout all of that. Excuse me. So we're going to look at this fellow by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes. And of course, he is one of these descendants of one of these kings, of these four generals, amongst whom the kingdom of Alexander was divided. And we're getting down to the time frame in which we're within a couple of hundred years of the coming of John the Immerser, who's going to prepare the way for the Lord and make his path straight. And so we're talking about, specifically on this little section here, and remember, we made this observation, which, if I didn't read it, I wouldn't never known it, obviously. Just because you have these four different generals being responsible, and of course two of them being more powerful than the other two, and that's according to prophecy as well in the book of Daniel, they are going to be infighting amongst themselves and taking over properties in opposition to the very ones amongst whom the land was divided. They didn't get along well, in other words. And so you have various sections of land that is taken by one group and then is taken by another group, and there's warring and fighting over all things. And so the very nation there in Palestine and the kingdom of Israel, of course, going to be swapping hands back and forth and back and forth. And they're trying to do the best they can, at least some of them are, to remain faithful in spite of all those things that are happening to them. But notice here we're going to read into some more words here. I'm going to spend a little bit of time thinking about it. Under Roman numeral number 2, how that he invaded, this Antiochus Epiphanes invaded Egypt 170 BC. Before doing so, notice what he did. He removed the high priest, whose name was Jason, and he put a fella in there who has a funny name, Menelaus. I don't know if that's correct or not, but that's what it looks like to me. He made him as a high priest instead. Now, what's the big problem here? Is there a problem here? Doesn't a king or a person in charge have the right? Well, of course he don't have the right to do that, you know. But yet here he is sticking his nose into spiritual business, and we liked it a whole lot better, and they did too, when their conquerors allowed them to do what they wanted to do religious-wise, as long as they kept on paying the taxes. Well, that's way in the past now. And this fellow that he is elevated to the point of being high priest is a Jew, which is good, you know. At least he's a Jew, but he's not a what? He's not from the tribe of Levi. So he doesn't have a right to be priest or high priest for sure, either one, see. Now he's a Jew who's been influenced by the Greek culture to the point that he's looked upon as being Hellenized, obviously. But that doesn't matter when it comes to the instructions that God gave relative to the priesthood amongst his people. And so it's somewhat amazing here. And again, I'd like to, it'd be amazing as you're just having to deal with these matters, because in point number 2 there, word came to Jerusalem that Antiochus had been killed. Well, now even today, you got to be careful with the information that you get, because it may not be accurate information, you know. Well, back here, it wasn't accurate information either, but as soon as word got out that he had been killed, then Jason hurried to Jerusalem, and he took back on the position of being the high priest. And then, whoops, he's not really dead. Well, how well is that going to bode for Jason from then on? So this false information has caused him to act in such a way that there's going to be obvious repercussions from that. And then there's a second invasion into Egypt. He is pressured by the Romans to give up all claims to Egypt, and he gets mad and takes it out on who? The Jews, of course. Here's somebody, it's like I think we mentioned even on Sunday, you know, fellas had a hard day at work, and he comes in, kicks the cat or kicks the dog, and does something like that, you know, taking it out on somebody else that didn't have anything to do with the situation he finds himself in, but that's exactly what he does. And in his frustration, he decides to really do a number on the Jewish people and offers a sow on the temple altar. And anybody who had the gumption to oppose what he was doing, what did he do to them? He killed them. Now, there's a significant statement that is made right there by the powers that are in charge as to don't mess with what we're going to do. It doesn't matter whether it doesn't sit well with your religion or not. If we want to do it and we're going to show our authority over you, and we had a bad day in having to deal with the Romans, we're still going to do it. And if you try to buck us, then we're going to kill you. Well, again, now here's the situation. How would you respond in the face of that? Would you start making plans to maybe take him out? You know, would you see if you couldn't band together, or see if there's going to be somebody coming along later, maybe the next one in line to take this position that won't be such a sorry person as he is? You know, what are you going to do? Well, it just so happens that it ends up getting taken care of because of what is referred to as the revolt of the Maccabees. And we'll see that in this next section. There's a historical statement that's made here at the bottom of the page that I think is pretty good. The spirit of the Jews under the Seleucids, in particular under Antiochus Epiphanes, unknown to the Seleucidae, and that's just all of the Seleucids together, they had stimulated a spirit of nationalism among the Jews. Tired of the oppression and the years of Gentile domination or dominion, they prayed and conspired to be free. This determination not only produced the Maccabean revolt, but permeated Jewish thought into the New Testament era by the time of this fellow, son of Choba. Among the Orthodox developed a longing for a military political Messiah who would smash the Gentile war machine. This is why so many were disenchanted with Jesus' teaching and with his actions, because what? He didn't fit the bill. You know, they had a different idea. You know, they wanted a Messiah to be as tall as Saul had been, and have a sword that would make Goliath's sword look small, and come in and whip all the Romans, and riding in on a big white horse, you know. But that's not who Jesus was. That was not what he was prophesied to be. Was he a conquering king? Well, yeah. But the concept of conquering and being a king just did not jive with what Jesus came to make possible. Jesus was the Prince of Peace, but yet he came bringing a sword. And figuring into that whole situation, individuals had to determine as to whether they wanted to be at peace with God or be at peace with man, you know. Did Jesus come to bring peace? Well, yes, he did. But there was also war that went along with that, even from people's own families. That nationalism, again, you know, this tendency to, and of course, I mean, if there's ever any concept that was more front page material than the present than that, I don't know what it'd be, you know. And while the whole idea of nationalism can be looked upon in a positive and a negative way, here it was a way of them banding themselves together with their ideas together, and even though they were off on stuff for sure, at least they were trying to accomplish the same thing, and that is get rid of those who would impede their freedom to worship God the way the law of Moses said for them to worship, you know. And it just so happened that it happened to be Gentiles that was doing it. It wouldn't have mattered who it was, you know. Everybody that's not a Jew is a Gentile. But they got tired of people invading their freedom of religion, and thus they end up being very, very militant and joining together a concept of political prowess as well as religious prowess together in the same person, and that's what ends up happening in this next little section. All right? If anybody's got any comments, no questions, just comments, then we'd like to hear them. All right, we get over here to remember a few years back, I preached a lesson on the lost books of the Bible, remember? And I did it because there was a weekly reader book club at school, and they had this books that they would sell, you know, from the weekly reader of all things, and there was one little old paperback book in there called The Lost Books of the Bible, you know. And lo and behold, I went down here to the library, and they actually had the book, you know, Lost Books of the Bible. Well, people start, if somebody sees that sitting there and says, I didn't know there was any lost books of the Bible, you know. And of course, what found out from doing a little bit of research is that book that was the Lost Books of the Bible was actually a compilation of two books that originated back in the 1700s, okay? And they purported to be lost, inspired books that, and the statement on the cover of the book was that the Catholic Church tried to suppress for centuries. Well, once you see that, say, man, I can't believe them Catholics. I mean, here we got inspired documents that we would have access to. If it weren't for the Catholics, they've kept it out of our hands. They've suppressed it. Well, that was just a big old fat lie. That wasn't true. There wasn't anything in those writings that were not known about. Now, what was known is some of them may have been ancient, but there wasn't none of them inspired. It was crazy stuff, you know. And we even looked at some of them. One of them was the Gospel of Thomas, you know. And in that Gospel of Thomas is recorded when Jesus was like 5 or 6 years old, you know, and he was playing out in a mud hole, and he got some mud and put it together and made some birds, and the birds, after he made these mud birds, they flew away, you know. And some little old kid running around on the playground with him bumped into him, and he got mad at him and killed him right there, you know. That's not inspired. That's crazy, you know. But that's what was supposedly a lost book about. Well, the same thing happens too. If you've ever seen a quote-unquote Catholic Bible, then you know they got a whole lot more books in their Bible than we got in ours, you know. And that's because of what's referred to as the Apocrypha. Writings that came into existence, guess when? During this 400 years in which God's not speaking. Now, let's think about that from a common sense, rational standpoint. If God is not speaking for 400 years, and then here are some books that are being presented as if they are inspired during those 400 years, what can we say about those books? They're not inspired. That's what we can say. We don't have to know everything about them. We don't have to know anything about them. But we know that if God is being silent, then there are no inspired books being provided. And some of them, of course, have direct historical value to some of the things that's going on right here. You know, you got 1st and 2nd Maccabees. Well, reckon where they get a term like that? Well, how about this Maccabean time here, for sure, and other such goings-ons as that. And the thing was about those Apocrypha, even the Roman Catholicism did not recognize them as inspired until the Protestant Reformation began. And then it became pretty obvious that some of the things that Roman Catholicism was teaching couldn't be found in the actual Bible, but it could be found in some of these apocryphal books. And so all of a sudden they say, well, these are inspired books too, and if you don't accept them as inspired, then we're going to cut your head off, you know. We're going to kick you. You're going to be a heretic, you know. And but there never was inspired, and they admitted that until they start trying to find justification for various doctrines of Roman Catholicism that are actually found in these apocryphal books, like praying to the dead. Can you find anything about praying the dead? Praying to saints after can you read anything like that in the Bible? No. Well, you can in the Apocrypha. Can you read anything about working your way to heaven in the Bible? No. You can in the Apocrypha, you know, and a whole lot of other things like that. Fanciful, foolish, comic book type stuff, but yet they're accepted as if they are accurate and inspired by Roman Catholicism. They're not. They're not. And of course, if you've got a whole group of people as large as Roman Catholicism claims to be, and they're accepting these as true, then if you point out they're not, then you have to do some explaining to them, you know, as to why that is the case. And so you need to be aware of that, and just a few little simple points like, if God's silent for 400 years, these